January 2009. Now I'm going to slow down just a bit here, because this is very important. The National Institute of Health Director of Bioethics wrote a paper for the Lancet, and he introduces something called the Complete Life System. And I'm going to read this for you, and again we're looking for patterns in thought, okay? Quote, consideration of the importance of the complete life system also supports modifying the youngest first principle by prioritizing adolescents and young adults over infants. So let's pause a second here. What's the youngest first principle? Well, in Western culture, we value our children. The future of a culture lies in the minds of its youth. So if you want to get something passed, you say, well, it's good for the kids. You know, it doesn't matter what the idea is. If it's good for the kids, of course you have to support it. Otherwise, you know, who are you? So you get all this craziness passed because it's good for the kids. You start and you say, you know, let's rethink this one. Instead of saying it's our kids that are the most important, let's prioritize adolescent and young adults over infants. He goes on. He explained this. Adolescents have received a substantial education in parental care. Investments that are going to be wasted without a complete life. So we'd hate to waste those investments. Infants, by contrast, have not yet received these investments. When implemented, the complete life system produces a priority curve on which individuals between the ages of roughly 15 and 40 years of age get the most substantial chance, a little time out here, most substantial chance of what? Well, to be fair, the issue he's struggling with, and when he wrote this paper, is what do we do with medical procedures in an age of scarce resources? Well, I kind of hate to break it to you, we're living in an age of scarce resources. We're broke. You know, we don't have money to fund Medicare, we don't have money to fund Medicaid. So we're having to start to struggle with what do we do when we are running out of money, and we're there. So he says, back up one if you are. So he says, let's, forward one. There we go. So he says, let's produce a priority curve on which individuals between the ages of roughly 15 and 40 years get the most substantial chance of a medical procedure in an age of scarce resources. Whereas the youngest and the oldest people, well, they get chances that are somewhat attenuated. One more. Unlike allocation by sex or race, allocation by age is not discrimination. Treating 65-year-olds differently because of stereotypes, now that would be ageist, and we can't have that. But treating them differently because they have already had more life years is not. So he's saying the elderly have already had more life years, so if we treat them differently, that's all right. Now, who is this gentleman? Ezekiel Emanuel. Who's Ezekiel Emanuel? And deputies, and one more. Yeah, you beat me the last line. Rahm Emanuel's brother, and Rahm Emanuel, of course, was White House Chief of Staff. But Ezekiel Emanuel was a White House healthcare policy advisor for the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act. Now, in this next slide, we're thinking about patterns in thought. We've watched Plato, we've watched Nietzsche, we've watched Singer, we've watched Emanuel. Now, look at this next slide. I take this from his paper, unaltered, okay? I haven't changed a thing, because it looks bad enough on its own. The bottom here, we have age in years, 0, 70. And here we have the probability of receiving an intervention and to finish the sentence in an age of scarce resources, okay? So he says, well, how do we distribute medical care? And I couldn't graph Plato's thinking more precisely. He says, well, infants that have a disability, well, they're a burden on society. They're expensive and they can't produce for the collective. Up here at the end, this is, you know, after age 60, 65, that's where people start to get sick. Their bodies break down. They use a lot of resources, and they've already given what they had to give to culture. They aren't producing, they aren't moving society forward, so they're a burden on society. Well, let's just kind of not do procedures over here. But those that are young, that are strong, that are fit, that are moving the collective forward, they get care. And I ask the question, how do you cut $500 billion from Medicare? Right there. Right there. And if we had more time, and I'm going to end my section here pretty quick, the legislation, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, actually lays out the mechanism to accomplish this. There's something called the IPAP, Independent Payment Advisory Board. It's 15 members that are given legislative authority. And in some ways that IPAP makes me so upset I'd love to talk about it. Essentially, the IPAP stands the tempering effect of the Senate on its head. Normally, when there's an advisory board, they say, here's a good idea to the Senate. And the Senate has to take that idea and actively incorporate it into law. And for that law to pass, it needs 60 votes to pass cloture, to overcome a filibuster. So to get that idea through the Senate, you have to have 60 votes to pass it. The IPAP, on the other hand, stands this on its head. You need 2 votes to vote it down, otherwise it becomes law. Okay, it's essentially the IPAP starts writing law that has to be voted down the first time. The Senate has to say by a 60-vote majority, this is a horrible idea. But then it still becomes law. This is the piece that really, really gets me. What we're watching is the breakdown of the rule of law here in the United States. What you see in the second vote is the Senate has to find cuts of equal or greater value to pass of its own accord in order to block the recommendations of the IPAP. So what this does is it creates a very, very clever, corrupt as all get out, a very clever escape hatch for the congressional leaders. The IPAP can come up with this atrocious idea. So we're going to cut this money, you know, we're broke. So let's say no chemotherapy, no dialysis, no cardiac CAS, or transplants for anybody over 65. Let's say that's the recommendation of the IPAP. Let's say all 100 senators say, oh man, that is just a terrible idea. We're all voting against it. It still becomes law unless those 60 senators, at least 60, go on record to say, here's what we're going to do instead. And of course, they're never going to go and cut seniors' care more than the IPAP did because they'd never be reelected. So the IPAP's recommendations become law, but the really corrupt but clever part is those same senators can come back to you and say, I did everything I could to stop it. That was the worst idea I've seen. I really didn't want this to happen. Man, I'm so sorry I couldn't stop it. So they gave themselves an out. They designed it so the IPAP has legislative authority, but they can come back and tell you that they fought it. Now that is corrupt. In some ways I feel like I can hardly believe this is America. I almost think I'm living in Stalinist Russia to have a 15-person board dictating what's going to happen to seniors' medical care. So I'll end there. I could go on for another hour, but I won't. But this is the difference between we the people loaning power to those in governance to live under the rule of law and then come back to live amongst we the people, as opposed to government seizing power and granting liberty to we the people. And when they run out of money, all of a sudden the things we thought we had are missing. Right there. Well, I'll quit there. Thank you so much for your time and letting me come speak.